Let's shift direction and move into leadership and cross-cultural perspective. I'm going to be looking at some case studies, but basically framing leadership in light of what's called the Globe study. The first book came out in 2004. There was another in 2009, another in 2013. A massive study of leadership and cultural values. GLOBE stands for Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness. There were 170 researchers, 17,000 middle managers in 62 countries across 3 industries. They were financial service industry, food service, and telecommunications. Their intent in choosing these is they're disparate and they don't follow the same rules and regulations as each other. Each could potentially have a different cultural approach to how they handle their business. So that's why they chose these 3. They're disparate services. They saw here the cultures as independent variables, so they were looking to see how they could measure them and how these cultural values impacted leadership. Cultural practices were compared to cultural values. In other words, you might say that everyone should be equal in the organization, but the reality is everyone's not equal in the organization. And so your practice is some are more equal than others, and you rate that on a scale from 1 to 6. But what the organization should be, or what you would value in the organization, everyone being equal, you rate that from 1 to 6, and looking at the differences between those two can be a very helpful piece to see what people say they value versus what they actually practice. And then global leadership dimensions were identified and examined both by a scour of the literature and by the people who were scholars of leadership coming together and wrestling with what things can we identify as factors in leadership. They identified not just positive factors, but negative factors as well, too. So dictatorial would be one type of leadership role that people would place, and these were often viewed, but not exclusively as negative, as we'll see a little bit later on. So here's the question that the Globe study was trying to answer. Does leadership practice depend on cultural values in practice? And you assume that it would, and what you want to do is discern this and then demonstrate it is essentially one of the main purposes. What attributes do people in a given society value in their leaders? What percentage of people in a large power-distant society value that? And I would say one thing that perhaps they looked at, though they didn't talk about this in the study, is how might this vary across industries? Do the food service people have the same orientation as the financial services people or the telecommunications people? And lastly, is the acceptance and success of leaders linked to cultural values? Now, again, you would assume all 3 of these would be yes, but having independent verification through statistical analysis is something that social scientists like to do. So 170 researchers from, I don't remember if they said how many countries they're from, but they're from dozens of countries. They're certainly not all American, but largely they're American and European. I know you've got some Asian. I don't remember seeing any Latin American social scientists. Doesn't mean that there aren't. I just don't remember seeing them in the study. Same thing with African social scientists as well, too. So the synopsis of this is 62 countries highlighted in bright green there in 10 different regions of the world. So you can see Africa is largely uncovered. It's hard to speak of the entire continent of Africa based on 4 or 5 countries. Latin America was far better served. Europe, you had a number served. East Europe, you have less coverage, and then you get over to the Asian direction and you regain a certain amount of coverage as well, too. I will focus a little bit more on Europe. There were 23 European countries in 5 different regions here. I've given each of these a slightly different color, so it's easy to distinguish them apart from each other. 9 cultural traits. They're not the same ones we've used in this course, but 9 cultural traits were examined across them. I'll get to those in a minute. At the same time, they identified through a literature search and through interviews with people 122 attributes of leaders. They took those 122 attributes and came up with 21 primary leadership dimensions, each dimension involving 5 or 6 of these attributes. Then they took those leadership dimensions and combined them into 6 global leadership dimensions. And in this, in comparison with the literature, they identified a couple of dimensions that were not found in the literature that they wanted to measure and see what the reality was of how culture impacts this. The theoretical model is, as laid out in the 2013 volume, is this. You've got societal culture, norms, and practices, and these impact the economic performance of societies. It was generally found that the more democratic the society, the greater the economic performance of the society. We watched a video of individuals and collectivism in politics and economics, and it was what they would be saying is they would agree that stronger individualism does result in better economic performance of a society in general. They looked at the physical and psychological well-being of societies. Now, the colors mean that these were studied in the 2004 and 2007 studies. If they're still blank, it means they haven't yet been studied. But they also looked, if you've got the societal norms, in what way then do you have leadership values in the culture that conform to those norms or don't conform to those norms? And then in addition, it's not just the values, but it's the practice. What's the organizational form, culture, and practices in the society? In the 2013 study, they added this concept of the leadership attributes and behaviors built on the culturally endorsed implicit and the societal culture. So they were saying, what do we actually see in leaders, and what way does that compare to both the practices and the values in that society? If you were to go on from there, they also studied how these fit into the acceptance and effectiveness of leaders. If you're from a large power distance, high context, collectivistic, gender role separated society, does it mean that large power distance, high context, collective, large gender role separated leaders will more likely be successful than those who cut against the grain? If you remember, I've said several times in the course that often dynamically growing religious movements are movements that are both inside and outside of the culture. So you might ask yourself, would this be true of leadership as well too? And I would anticipate the best leaders are both inside and outside the culture. There's something slightly different about them, but they're enough inside the culture that they're still trusted. They're not seen as social misfits. And something that hasn't been studied is how do they prepare for contingencies when things go wrong? We often say in relation to intercultural studies and often in terms of mission work, what happens when the toothpaste tube gets squeezed? What comes out? And typically when the pressure is on, you resort to what is normative for you, wherever you are in the world and whatever your norm is. And study of that has yet to be done, but that's the type of study that will examine that. What comes out when the toothpaste tube of the organization is squeezed? You can ask yourself right now, at Wheaton, we're facing some challenges on the graduate school side in terms of enrollment. So our toothpaste tube is being squeezed right now. Wheaton historically has not had much in the way of online courses. It's been the outlier departments such as evangelism, leadership, missional church movements that have gone in new directions with delivery systems. They don't fit well in Wheaton's organizational structure. And yet, if we come to a stage where enrollment is small enough that we have to rethink graduate school work, what direction are we going to go? And that's where you'll likely see Wheaton cultural norms come to play in terms of people making a decision. And at this point in time, it's an interesting thing to think you've got three sets of powers involved in making any decision at Wheaton. One set of power is the faculty who will actually design the curriculum and teach the courses. Second set is the administrator of the school, which tries to guide and lead faculty in making decisions, and yet faculty have a hard time making really difficult decisions. So often the administration has to come alongside and make a decision, and then faculty express frustration because they say it's a top-down institution. When from at least my vantage point is that faculty don't know how to make the tough decisions because we're such a consensual group, and any faculty of any institution is a bunch of really smart people who are trained in tearing each other's arguments apart. So try and put that kind of group together to make a good decision on something that's contentious, and you can see how much of a problem that would be. But the third layer of people who are in the decision-making process is the Board of Trustees at Wheaton. And they can declare by fiat that we shall do something. For example, we will go online, and should they do that, then the faculty and the administration will have to comply with that, and we'll just have to find ways to do it. We're reminded on a regular basis at the college, the literal owners of Wheaton College are not the faculty, they're not the administration, it's the Board of Trustee legally that is incorporated as the ownership of this college. So they are the owners of this business of educating at Wheaton, and what they say ultimately goes. Okay, so again, that just gives you a framework here for globe theoretical model, but it's also helping you see perhaps how that might work out at a place like Wheaton, where it is a lot of people who are individualists, who are low context, who tend to be lower power distance, and that's the reason they say, as faculty especially, they don't like a top-down administrative model. But yet we're all reporting to a single board, which can be a very top-down type of group. So how is that going to get worked out? Time is going to